As always, our show is sponsored by Memoria Press. You can find our curriculum at memoriapress.com.
Welcome to Classical Etc., a show from Memoria Press that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
On today's episode of Classical Etc., we're going to discuss one of our favorite authors, Wendell Berry, and one of his best short stories, Fidelity. And I think instead of having any kind of on-ramp, we're just going to get right into it because we have been trying our hardest not to talk to each other about this short story for the last 2 hours because it's just so interesting.
And it's quite a long short story.
Now, for the audience, a couple of caveats. It is pretty long, but it is so worth the read. You can find it in a collection of his short stories called Fidelity, and that includes 5 other stories. And then you can find it also in another collection of short stories called That Distant Land. And I'm sure you can find it on its own as well, but those are the 2 places where you can find this short story. And before we get into a discussion of it, I do want to just give just a very, very brief synopsis of the plot to orient people to our discussion. And the beauty of that is that nothing happens in Wendell Berry's books, which makes it so much easier to give a summary of the plot. I kid, but also that's it is fascinating how riveting his stories are.
Without a lot of action.
With nothing happening.
Right.
But this is essentially the story of an older man, I believe he's 88, and he's in his final days, and he's very, very sick. And he's admitted to a hospital in Louisville, and his son, Danny Branch, and the man's name is Burley Coulter. His son, Danny Branch, decides he's going to rescue him from the medical establishment, sneaks his body out of the hospital, and then takes him out to the wilderness where he buries his father who passes away. And during his escape from the hospital, of course, is alarmed. They call the police. There's an investigation into who does it. And the people of Port William, this imaginary city that Wendell Berry writes all of his stories in, come together to interfere with the investigation and make sure that Danny Branch is okay. That's the story in a nutshell. Anything from that you guys would add any important details before I get into our first question?
Well, it leaves out all the important details.
Exactly.
But, that's right. Yeah, I mean, Wendell, there are certain writers and certain stories where if you were to give a very objective description of what happens, you would probably not want to read it. And Wendell's one of those writers that if you would try to explain what the story was about, it would not have any appeal. Sure. It's all the appeal is in the reading of it, and in his sort of meditative style of writing, a style where he's able to say things. He's able to say things that I don't think any other writer is able to say.
Yeah.
But I'm going to disagree.
Am I supposed to be surprised?
Well, no. I think the subject of this story is fascinating, and I think I would have wanted to read it just because of stealing somebody from the hospital who's dying. I think we've all been there with somebody close to you that is hooked up in the hospital, and just, that are they dying with dignity there? Do they need to be there? How much money is this costing when we've come so far in the medical field that now apparently we can just keep people alive forever. Whereas when people used to die at home, it was just such a more natural, but maybe it's just something that I've thought a lot about.
I agree with Tanya, given Martin's caricature of this story, that you may, if you hear the synopsis of it, you may not want to read it. If you were to phrase it as a man kidnaps his father from the hospital to take him
to the woods to die.
That's a great, let me read that story.
You all don't understand promotion. Here's what you say. You say, this is Wendell Berry's only detective story.
Yeah. But I think on that point, I agree with both of you, because I think, Tony, what you're saying is that it's so much more than just the moment when Danny is rolling Burley out on the gurney. You know, like
There's
he doesn't have a gun. He doesn't have to fight his way out, you know, so there's no action necessarily. But things like, you know, Tall Proudfoot in a different story, jumping into a vegetable basket, or, you know, in Jayber Crow, Jayber loving in his heart a woman that he's not married to. Like, these are really interesting things that happen. So when I say nothing happens, it's tongue in cheek. But what the things that happen are not necessarily action in the sense that a lot of times we think it is when we talk about plot.
Oh, I agree that there's not a lot of action.
Yeah,
Or it's a very slow moving action in his stories and in his books. It's really very much like an agrarian life that is of a different time.
Yeah.
Well, and I wonder something because when there's a scene at the end of the story, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but there's a scene at the end of the story where they're all brought into a room at Wheeler Catlett's law offices. And there's all these characters in there. And I thought, you know, a person who is not familiar with Berry, you know, because I'm getting to the point, is this the first one to read?
It's the first one I read.
Is it the first one
It is the very first one I read, and there's a story behind that.
Well, but when they're all in there, and he's giving this litany of who's in this office,
Right.
and these are all people you know
Yep.
if you've read
If
Wendell
you've-
Berry.
yeah.
This is there any other scene in any of Wendell's other books which has this assembly of people? It's all the great characters. Hannah Coulter. I mean, everybody but Jayber Crow. You know, you don't have Jayber
Yep.
Crow in it.
Well,
But-
you don't have Matt.
And Matt Feltner,
Feltner,
yeah, right. But isn't there a Feltner in here, or he's mentioned anyway in the story?
He
Anyway,
is. They
well,
are.
yeah, because Hannah's
Hannah.
his daughter-in-law.
Mhm.
yeah. But there is this. This story is part of a whole world of stories. They're all. Some people may not know this, but Wendell Berry's books, it's all the same world. It's the world of Port William, and that's sort of the center to all of his stories. And I just that this is the one story which has, I think, most of the characters from that world that you know are in it,
Gathered in one
gathered
spot.
in one place.
So the purpose of this podcast in a lot of ways is because we love the fruit and the process of classical education, and people talk about the things they like. We get on this show, I guess, once a week or so now, and we just talk about the stuff we love, classical education, and through that we try to answer questions about classical education from our experience, and we ask questions we don't have the answer to. So I want to frame this conversation in that reading this short story in this context, this is something we love. And I think we love it in some ways for the same reasons we love classical education. Tanya, do you agree with that? And can you maybe make any connections between some of the reasons that you have loved being a part of classical education and this work and why it's important and what you find important and enjoyable about this story?
I think the first thing that for me is that would lead this to be more of a classical bent is the prose, the beautiful sentences. I mean, I could go through here and pick out so many beautiful sentences it's just one sentence, but it says so much. He's just a beautiful writer.
Mhm.
And so that's the first thing. And the other thing is, all the themes that we are constantly talking about in classical education, within literature, are in here. Community, and what's unique to Wendell about community is that, that idea of membership, that we are members one of each other, and that if something happens to me because I'm part of this membership, then it also happens to you. That is a huge Wendell theme throughout.
Can we pause on that? Tease that out a little bit. Paul, how does the membership idea, such a central concept for Wendell, how does it work out in this story? Kind of talk about some of the characters and how membership is illustrated.
Well, so when Danny decides to go rescue his father from the hospital, he doesn't say much to his wife. All he says is, "I'm going to get him." Doesn't say who him is, and he tells her, if anybody asks, just tell them I said something about Indiana. And so when the hospital calls his wife looking for Danny, thinking, well, maybe it was Danny that, and the detective thinking maybe it was Danny that took his father, she knows that, deep down that Danny's got him. But she just says, he said something about Indiana. And so she protects him. And then when it becomes clear that the detective knows that it was a man in a blue shirt that took Burley, well, Nathan's his, is he a relative at all? Anyway, it was Nathan
Coulter
to Danny. Well, I guess he'd be cousins then. No.
Gosh,
either cousins or uncle, and I can't remember.
Anyway,
if he's Burley's brother or cousin.
wait,
Nathan's the nephew of Burley,
right?
So then he'd be the cousin of Danny.
Yes.
Yeah. So Nathan, his cousin, then sneaks off to put a green shirt where Danny will find it. So by the time Danny comes back to the community, he's not wearing a blue shirt anymore, right? But he doesn't tell us why. I mean,
which is what he was wearing when he took Burley.
Right.
So he's not incriminated.
Right. And so everybody's doing these things in order that, and even the lawyer who's a friend is in ways they're obstructing to provide for the humanity of their fellow member. Right. Even though the argument could be, well, they did something illegal. I don't really think it should be illegal to take somebody out of a hospital. But the law was seen as kidnapping, but they are all protective of each other's humanity.
There's that great discussion between, I believe it's Wheeler, when Detective Bode is talking to Wheeler, and he's like, who actually owns?
Right. And he says,
Burley.
I just turned to that. Somehow you and I are the same. He says, Wheeler says to Bode, there are several of us here who belong to Danny and to whom he belongs, and we'll stand by him whatever happens. They all together were involved without words in this conspiracy to rescue Burley and to let him die with dignity in the woods that he loved.
Martin, what is Wendell Berry, the author, responding to or reacting to feel the need that he needs to write these stories about how important membership is? What do you think he's observing in the culture that makes him feel this way?
Well, he's observing this disintegrating impulse that there is in culture. That he writes a lot about small towns where there is this organic unity of the members, the people in the town, and he contrasts that with life in the city. Which is very disintegrating. You're the sort of irony that out in a place in a small town where people live further apart, they're closer together than the people who live closer together in the city. And so this whole city country contrast that you see throughout his writing. Louisville is which we're sitting in right now.
Yeah.
Louisville. It serves a literary role that I've noticed in a number of different stories. It's Babylon. It is, if you read Cry the Beloved Country by Alan Paton, about South African and in the days of apartheid, Johannesburg serves that role as Babylon. And this is in a lot of different literature, the use of a place or a city as this corrupting influence, and it stands in turn for this whole corrupting influence in our culture, mainly modern technology, which is I think one of the themes in this story, is what technology can do. And I was just explaining before the show started, I lost my cell phone recently, and you have no idea how tied in you are through your phone to everything. I lose it at the airport, and I'm just standing there in the airport, and I'm going, what do I do? Payphones are gone.
They're gone.
You can't call anyone. And then you just as the days went on last week when I was on a trip, it just more and more things you're just dependent on that pull you away in many ways. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of nice not to have a phone. You got to talk to people now in person. So I think a lot of the themes in his stories have to do with the city, with a disintegrated culture, with technology. I think is another thing he's really implicitly referring to here.
On that note of technology, it's interesting because when it talks about Lyda and Danny having a phone, they only got the phone because the local school was closed down and they were being bused to Hargrave, which is going to be like an hour and a half one way. And Lyda was like, we need to be able to be in communication.
Our children need to be able to call us.
Technology creates its own requirements.
But the funny thing about that is this line, it went right on ringing as if she weren't rushing to answer it. I just thought that was so funny. And it's how you feel when your phone is ringing and ringing and ringing and you can't get there, but it won't stop.
The idea of getting technology so it makes things easier, it actually creates many more requirements than it does away with.
And what's interesting is, right, Danny's insistent when they get that phone line, it's only going to be the kids.
Is anyone going to call us?
Nobody's really going to call us.
But then, in some ways, the telephone allows for Nathan to be informed so that Nathan can bring that green shirt to Danny. It allows Wheeler to be informed so that he does what he needs to do to get the community together. So in some ways
yes, because Hannah calls Henry in the middle of the night to say the hospital called Lyda. Or did Lyda
I think
call?
Lyda calls him. Lyda calls him in the middle of the night, and he can't sleep again because he's
trying
worried.
to figure out what are we going to do.
Right.
Because everybody knows, even though that's the great thing about this story, nobody has said. They haven't said it between themselves. Nobody has
they just
acknowledged.
Say Burley's gone, and everybody knows.
Yes, and I love that when the hospital tells, when Lyda finally does get to the phone, and the hospital, this is Danny's wife, and says they're looking for Danny and to tell him, and she says he's gone to Indiana. And then the hospital says, Mr. Burley Coulter has disappeared. And Lyda says, oh. She was grinning into the dark, and there had been a tremor of relief in her voice that she trusted might have passed for dismay. Relief that Burley had been taken away. Freed. Yes.
Liberated.
Freedom. I mean, freedom.
And this whole idea of the hospital as a place that you voluntarily take someone to, and they will treat you. But then when you try to get out, it becomes something like a prison.
There is, I don't know if it's Henry or Wheeler that makes that point to the detective.
It's
later on.
Wheeler, yes. And he says if he needs their permission to get out, he's in jail.
Right. And Wheeler implies some economic motivation, right? Like this person lying in your bed is costing this person hundreds of thousands of dollars.
They worked their whole lives to save a couple $1,000s, and at the very end, it gets taken away.
And now, in the name of saving you, they're ruining you.
Yes, and he says that because Bode says that the reason Danny stole Burley is because he wanted his inheritance. Because he was like, who is inheriting from this man?
And if we could underscore again for the people who haven't read the story, Bode, he's a detective in Louisville who's investigating this disappearance of this old man from the hospital. And we had a little discussion before. I've always thought it was Bode, and because I've heard that name before, but everyone's going to use Bode, so I'll stipulate for now that it's Bode.
Well, let's stay on Bode / Bode for a little bit. One of the wonderful ways that this story is constructed is that you move from point of view a few times in the story. And so for a little bit, it's from the point of view of Danny Branch. For a little while, it's and that's the son of the man who's dying in the hospital. Sometimes from the point of view of Henry Catlett, the small town lawyer, who's actually just a friend to everyone, as he says. And then you have the point of view of Detective Kyle Bode, or Bode, whichever you prefer. I say Bode.
Yeah.
And during that time, it seems like what Wendell Berry is doing is giving us insight into the kind of person who has been raised in this Louisville situation.
He's personified.
What do you all think is the best way to describe who Detective Bode is and why he's a good anti-type for the story.
His life sounds miserable.
It does sound miserable.
Absolutely.
So tell us about his life.
Well, he's
divorced.
He's divorced.
There's been infidelity in his life twice, right?
Ironic choice of words there. Infidelity.
Yes. Oh,
with the title of the story being Fidelity.
yes, it is. Aren't you something? And he feels seedy to me, but he's also he's young and he's just trying to figure things out, and he can't. I mean, there's no way that he is going to be able to compete in dialogue with Wheeler Catlett. It's just not. And he says, "I'm here to serve the law." And Wheeler says, "But my dear boy, you don't eat or drink the law or sit in the shade of it or warm yourself by it or wear it or have your being in it. The law exists only to serve." And Bode says, "Serve what?" And Wheeler says, "Why? All the many things that are above it. Love."
Do you need to customize your curriculum for the year, but don't want to juggle all the separate lesson plans? Memoria Press has you covered. Introducing the digital Customized Curriculum Manual. Like our standard printed curriculum manuals that you know and love, the digital Customized Curriculum Manual contains all the same comprehensive teaching guidelines, complete lesson plans, and appendix materials, but tailored to the needs of your students, and for the same price. You can purchase the standalone customized manual and build it from scratch yourself, or you can buy it as part of a customizable curriculum package, which will automatically import all the subject changes you make in your package. No matter how you purchase, you can always navigate to My Curriculum Manuals on your account at memoriapress.com to download your customized curriculum manual and get the latest updates to your lesson plans. Visit our website for more information or contact our customer service representatives for any assistance with creating your new manual. Memoria Press. Classical, Christian, complete.
Wendell changes perspectives, and we get to learn about Detective Bode. He says that he was 29 years old already, and he had been confused as much as most people. In spite of the law and the government and the police, it seemed people went right on and did whatever they were going to do. They had motives that were confusing, and they left evidence that was confusing. So Bode's a kind of man that's trying to make sense of everything.
Right.
And he's being contrasted with a world in which everything doesn't make sense. Sometimes the right thing isn't what the law states it is. And
people that are living a more simple, with a more simple set of rules that are based on love.
That's right.
He's not wise, and he's not virtuous, and he doesn't know what love is. In contrast with everybody else in the room and who have gathered together, and he's not just, even though he's in an official position of justice. He doesn't know what justice is, and again, I think this is one of Wendell's swipes at the artificial systems that we have created in modern life. We have a justice governmental apparatus, but is it just? We have a health industry. Is it healthy? I think that Wendell's interrogating all of these assumptions that we have, and he makes Bode, if that's his name, he makes him into this personification of everything that's wrong with the world. And in total contrast, this whole story to me is a contrast between him and Danny Burley, one or both. It's a contrast between the two, and we see it. Wendell doesn't say it anywhere, but we see the difference between these two kinds of people: the just, the wise, the virtuous, the people who love, as opposed to this person who comes into their world from outside it, from Babylon, in the role of justice, not doing what is really just.
I found it really interesting that Detective Kyle Bode, when Wendell Berry is framing his internal dialogue, he frames his job as trying to be being smarter than the people he's talking to. It's always about, Is he smarter than the people he's talking to? And I find that really interesting because it seems like that it reminds me of like in perhaps in Magician's Nephew with the professor, the way that Lewis kind of symbolizes the scientific mindset is facts and their use. And what can I accumulate as much factual knowledge as I can, and then I will be able to do everything as efficiently as I'm able to do. And even in the story, it's way more textured than in Narnia, but this detective is doing a job. There's a utility to it, and he feels that the best way to do it is to have the most factual knowledge. And these are people like Art Rowan Berry is probably not as smart as other people in the city, but there is a wisdom there that all of these people in the membership share because they were not raised in that utilitarian set of ideals.
Can I tell you a joke?
Yeah, let's hear it.
It's relevant here. Okay. Okay. So there's this old country farmer, and this city person buys a farm next door. And so this city person gets out there. He wants to do some shooting, bird shooting. So he goes out there and he shoots this bird. And it falls on the old farmer's property next door. So he goes over to get it, and the old farmer comes out. So what are you doing? And the guy said, well, I'm getting a bird that I shot. Well, yeah, but you shot it on my property. So it's my bird. And the city guy said, look, I shot the bird. Getting this little argument. So the old farmer says, okay, we got a way of handling these things around here. Okay. So what we do is one of us gets to kick the other person as hard as he can. And then the other guy gets to kick him back, and whoever's left standing gets the bird. So the city guy says, well, okay. So he's figuring he's so much bigger than this little country farmer. So he says, well, the farmer says, you go first. The farmer goes first. So the farmer kicks this city guy and kicks him so hard, the guy is just on the ground writhing. So then he gets up because it's his turn, and the farmer looks down at the bird and says, oh, you can have it. It's like, can't believe the city guy fell for this. Yeah. So there's this practical wisdom. It's all through this story that is contrasted with this arrogance. It's not just that it's wrong. It's arrogant on the part of this detective because he thinks these people are just rubes. They're not rubes. Right. They're smarter than you are.
Martin, I want to follow up on the joke. I'm sorry. Is that actually did you get kicked by a farmer at one point? And you're just telling a life story, a life lesson you learned?
I'm not commenting on that.
Okay.
But
I came from California out to Kentucky.
Yes.
And I had this attitude that these people are stupid. No, they're way more clever than you are because they've lived a real life and they've lived in a community. They know people better than I know people. So.
Can I say something? In Bode, he's a very negative character, but there is hope for him by the end. So he does say he had been tempted over and over again to leave with Wheeler the small, clear world of the law and its explanations, and to enter the larger, darker world not ordered by human reasons or subject to them, in which he sensed obscurely that something might live that he too might be glad to have alive. So he does come along. Wheeler brings him along. And then he basically, don't you feel like the end of this book? So Danny Branch basically has a funeral for his father in the woods when he buries him. He digs that grave by himself. The pages dedicated to the care that went into the building of the grave. And then taking, when he picks him up and he says it, when he picks Burley up to take him and he says, and he just held him a moment. And then he takes him out and he puts him in that grave and he stands there and he looks at him and then he starts covering, and then he covers it. It's all that is a funeral. And then I feel like at the very end, that is the funeral of the family and friends. At the story ends in Wheeler's office. in this room with all of these people with Bode, and Bode then got to be a member. He got to be part of that membership.
Well, so what happened? This is, to me, one of the greatest scenes in Berry's books is this scene in Wheeler's office. And it's appropriate that it be in Wheeler's office, because to me, Wheeler Catlett, who appears in a number of Berry's stories, he's sort of the defender of tradition.
And just to catch everyone up, Wheeler and Henry, father-son, they're lawyers in this town of Port William. And Henry tells everyone who knew Burley Coulter, the man who died, to come to the office. And as the reader, you're not totally sure why, but you kind of know why. And so that's what you're talking about. This scene when they all finally assemble there and the detective is there interrogating them.
They all gather in all these great characters from Wendell's books. And
everybody but Danny.
Well, he comes later, right?
Right.
But I think, though, Henry just wanted to make sure he didn't want the detective to get each of them by themselves because he was afraid.
Sure.
Because separate, divide.
They were
and
all
conquer.
protecting Danny.
Right. They were. But what happens in the office? What do they do? And what do they explain to the detective? They don't talk about why it's justified to go into a hospital and pull an old guy out and go bury him in the woods. They simply articulate who Burley Coulter was. That's what they do. They just tell him who this person that's abstract to him, that's not a real person to him, but just a case. They tell him who he was, and this is in line with a lot of what Berry does in his stories, which is to articulate the human, that Burley Coulter was a human being who lived this great life in this community, and you who have come here from outside our community to exert justice don't have any idea who you're talking about here.
And he doesn't idealize Burley, though. He does deal with Burley as a real flawed person. So, but it's a person that they love. It's a member.
Yeah, and they know
community.
Particular things about Burley that made him Burley, right? The fact that he would disappear into the woods for days, and Danny would go with him when Danny got older, but just they were like, this is fitting because he would go disappear into the woods.
And Burley's such a great character in a lot of the stories. He's sort of the jester, right? He's funny. He's a practical joker. He does all this funny stuff, and he's completely grounded in the natural world. And in this scene, to have all these different characters all talking about this one guy. This is the great. The story is what's the word? It's the place where Burley is honored as a member of this community, this Port William community, and by different people, so that you can get this multiple perspectives on Burley.
And you mentioned before, all of the themes of Wendell Berry seem to come together in this short story, and maybe in the best of any of his stories, but at least it certainly does here. And to belong is to be known, right? It's to be known. And that's when they talk in that group, they describe a person. And so if the discussion is who does Burley belong to, the hospital or this membership, they just have to establish that they know him. And all of those other themes that we've traced, technology, the medical establishment, the industrialism of the city, each of these are institutions that separate us from one each other and prevent knowing.
He was no longer in his right mind, they thought, because he was no longer in his right place.
Which happens to people in the hospital.
Oh, I know. Absolutely.
It does happen.
Yes.
They call it
well,
something.
My father-in-law passed away a couple years ago, and they took him to the hospital. And my wife and I were talking about this morning, and she brought this up, that they brought him to the hospital. All he wanted to do was to go home. He was dying, but the hospital is there to save the life. And they don't understand, it's all quantity of life. It's not the quality of life. And he was, my father was clearly dying, but they wanted to keep him there to keep him alive. And the question is, was that the best thing for him?
Mhm.
And it clearly was not. But
Right.
they can only see the hospital can only see one aspect of things, and it requires real people in a real community to see what's really important.
I made it clear to Shane this morning that if I'm dying anywhere else,
Just pull the plug on you right away.
then the farm.
I made a commitment
kidnap
to
me
never
and you
let
take
him
me back to the farm.
live longer than he wants to. I want to bring this all the way back around for our final question. With the classical education movement, I think that what we are trying to do in our schools and to encourage with homeschoolers is to, in our schools, create something that serves these kinds of communities rather than allow the education that we're providing or the schools that we're serving be something that actually contributes to the Louisville in this story, or contributes to these systems that break people apart from each other. How do you guys think classical education specifically is suited to do that? And how would you encourage teachers and people involved in classical education to lean into that work to help to create these kinds of environments? Paul, let's start with you.
To me, the fundamental question that we ask ourselves every day is, how do we help our students fulfill their potential as human beings? Right. And as we were talking about this, I was just thinking about the educational systems that purely want to prepare you for a job, right? They're not worried about whether you know what justice is, whether you know what wisdom is, whether you know what virtue is, all essential aspects to our humanity. And, the study of literature and history, even geography, and can all be called the humanities because it helps us know who we are. And so, in an educational system that is driven to helping children fulfill their potential, not just one aspect of their potential. Yes, it should prepare them well for a job, but it should prepare them well for adulthood. That should prepare them well for eternity, right? All of those things. And so, in that way, we can contribute to this community, right? If the only thing we're focused on is our jobs, and that's just what I often hear from people, they're worried about can their kid get a job, then we've missed what's going to make them a member.
That's beautiful. I just say amen.
Amen.
Yeah, I think we need to ask, what are the fundamental things that we share in our culture? What are the things that we need to know and have an affection for here in, as citizens of a country, as members of a community, and as we have a history, and we have a culture that has come from that history, that has developed out of it, and schools today are all about job skills, and if you look at a modern curriculum, it is disintegrated. It's just a bunch of stuff that is not related to the other stuff. And so what classical education is doing is articulating to students, who can hopefully then articulate it to other people and to themselves, what the true, the good, and the beautiful are, as those things, the things that make life worth living, and which are things that there's a long tradition of discussion and argument about. And I think that the role of a school is to familiarize those students with that central tradition, the thing that makes us Western people, the things that make us human beings. Those are the things that are the most important things. They need to be at the center of everything. So in this sense, I think classical education is an integrating thing rather than a disintegrating thing, which a lot of modern education is.
I mean, Danny Branch, what did it say? He dropped out of school before he finished the 8th grade, but
Right.
he was so wise, and he knew exactly what his father needed. And he took care of that with the support of his community. And those are the kinds of things that you're not really going to get from a book. But from lots of discussion and going really deeply into the things that we're studying and just learning how to be is it whole person you don't like? What?
I like that.
Okay.
But
there's
now,
some phrase I use that he doesn't like.
But now, since this kind of life that Berry articulates in his books is very hard to live because of our modern culture, we can at least read about it and know what it was and hopefully replicate it in our own lives.
Yeah.
And I think that community, it's titled Fidelity for a reason, right? I mean, that community comes by no matter what other people in the community do, we are faithful to those people.
Yeah,
Fidelity being the fidelitas being the Latin word for fidelity. For faithfulness.
No, that was beautiful.
No, it means faith. It means faithfulness.
And it ends with, with Wheeler saying to Mr. Bode, the city detective, Burley has disappeared into his people and his place, not to be found in this world again forever.
Everyone should read this book. I've enjoyed this conversation. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Classical Etc. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider liking this video. If you want to join the conversation, then you can comment below. And if you want to stay connected, please subscribe to our channel. I hope you enjoyed this show, and we'll see you next time.